Mom. So, and I wanted to thank all of you for giving me this chance to talk about a different way to serve your country. So I've been with the State Department of MomSed for 20 years. These are a list of the different places that I've served and the different assignments that I've had. I don't know if you can see in the back, but I've been to Africa, Asia, and Europe for work.
Time out for just 1 second. Can you hear her back there?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Good.
Keep it
If you want me to speak a little bit closer to the mic, I can do that too. Sorry. Okay, so as I said, I've served in Africa, Asia, and Europe for work, as well as Washington, D.C. One of the interesting things I did in D.C., I'll mention this because I'm in Arizona, was I spent a year detailed to the Senate where I worked for Senator Flake, so, who is now our ambassador to Turkey. So, let me make sure I learn how to operate the equipment. I'm just going to show a couple of pictures of a day in the life of a foreign service officer. One of my favorite pictures is up there at the top where I got to fire an RPG twice.
Wow.
A couple more pictures of just an average day. I'm going to stop here. The picture, whoops, there, the picture on the top is my staff when I served in Calcutta, India. My staff, in order to qualify to even apply to work for the U.S. Embassy, you had to speak at least 3 languages. Most of them spoke at least 4. So they were very dedicated, put in long hours, and this team is responsible for serving American citizens and issuing visas. Okay. Since I served in Africa, I wanted to talk for a minute about the greatest program the American taxpayer funds and the American taxpayer usually does not know about. But we are famous for it in the rest of the world. It's called PEPFAR. It is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. It is in multiple countries around the world. President Bush started it 20 years ago, so it's just coming up on its 20th anniversary. Through this program where we try to prevent AIDS, cure AIDS, we have saved 25 million lives around the world. We've helped 20 countries achieve epidemic control. This is important because of a number of reasons. First, it's the right thing to do. Second, it helps stop the spread of HIV to our shores or limit the further spread to our shores. Third, a lot of the countries we have PEPFAR in were not historically our allies. So by helping the citizens of those countries, we've really changed our relationship with a lot of these countries. Additionally, a lot of people don't realize that 20 years ago, it was very common to believe that if you had sex with a virgin, you could cure your AIDS. So this resulted in an epidemic of child rape. So we did a major campaign to try and limit and eliminate that scourge, and attitudes have changed over the last 20 years, I'm very proud to say. And then finally, as you're all veterans, this is an important fact. It leads to stabilization in other countries around the world. Because if your population, if all the parents and all the grandparents are knocked out by the epidemic, you're left with a population of 15 to 25-year-olds, usually boys. And if they have no mom and dad at home, they don't have a home, they don't have food, they can't go to school, they can't get a job because they haven't gone to school, and it leads to gangs, it leads to sometimes child soldiers, it opens up the area to become a hotbed for terrorism. So by investing in antiretroviral therapy a couple of decades ago, we're saving ourselves the cost of bullets and other ammunition and soldiers now because we've helped stabilize those countries. Another big thing we do is we go around and we promote education in the United States. So at the bottom right, I'm up there in Darjeeling, India, as in Darjeeling the tea, speaking to a school about study in the United States. And we do this for two reasons. The first is that students who come and study in the United States usually go back and have a much better opinion of the United States, and it builds mutual, understanding and fosters goodwill between our countries. That's really important. But also, it creates jobs in the United States. I looked up the statistics for Arizona alone, and in the 2017 to 2018 academic year, which is the last year we had statistics for, foreign students contributed $717 million to the Arizona economy. That's a huge number. I looked it up for California. It was $6.5 billion in that year. Those are just two states. So that's one of the reasons we go and spend a lot of time talking to schools. Okay, my first year I was in public diplomacy, where we try and win hearts and minds of foreign countries, in the country Georgia, which is south of Russia. They had just gone through their Rose Revolution, and they were part of the coalition of the willing in the Second Gulf War. I was concerned that if they began to experience casualties, public opinion might turn, and they may no longer be willing to be part of the coalition of the willing. So we thought about what we could do to solidify public support. And I suggested that we host a thank you concert to the Georgian troops. We recruited 17 acts, two comedians, jugglers, musicians, dancers, and in Georgia they dance with swords and knives, so it was very, very dramatic. There's one of the dancers with the Georgian flag. And we had the 1st Battalion that had just returned from Iraq in the audience. We had the 3rd Battalion that was about to go out in the audience, and it was broadcast live nationwide on Georgian State TV. We had the commander of the 1st Battalion get up and speak. And he said that when his troops went on their very first patrol in the desert, he decided that he would go with them. And they're out there in the desert, and they come across these people. It turns out to be an Iraqi family out on a picnic in the desert. The family's scared, the troops are nervous, wondering what in the world these people are doing out there. And it's a tense standoff until the child of the Iraqi family gets up, walks over, and hands the Georgians a red rose. The Georgians had just gone through the Rose Revolution a year before, so this was the symbol of their rebellion for democracy. And the commander said this was a sign to him that they had just achieved democracy, and that it was now their responsibility to help others around the world fight for their own democracy as well. So that solidified public opinion, and that was important to us because every foreign ally that we recruited and retained, every foreign troop that we helped send over to Iraq, freed up an American soldier, helped protect American lives, and so we consider that a big success. I'm going to skip this one. Okay, this is a list of some of the services that we provide to Americans around the world. I'm going to just talk about a couple of example cases, starting with welfare and whereabouts, which is when somebody contacts us and says, I'm concerned, I haven't heard from my American family member, could you find out what's going on? And we do this because sometimes the American is in jail, they are in a hospital, they've died, so we do track these people down. Most of the time it turns out to be a backpacker who has not bothered to contact mom in a few weeks. But the thought process is, we have to ask the family, well, what kind of traveler are they? A backpacker or a 5-star traveler? and I'll use a backpacker example. This particular backpacker, his family said, well, he's in Zambia somewhere. So we had to think, okay, what would a backpacker in the country of Zambia go see? We thought, Victoria Falls. Okay, so he's a backpacker in Victoria Falls. Where would he stay? Probably the backpacking hostel. So we called the backpacking hostel. We looked up his passport. We were able to describe him and said, have you seen this young man? And they, fortunately for us, they had recently seen him. Unfortunately for us, they had helped him buy tickets to a different country. So we had actually, it took us 4 countries before we caught up with this young man and said, call your mother. She's concerned. Then this other case I want to talk about is a good example as well, because it involves the Privacy Act and what we can and can't say. So in this particular case, an adult woman was working in a conflict zone in Africa. Then she was going to travel to my country, where I was, the Gambia in West Africa. But she called her mother and said, Mom, I'm going to come home tomorrow. Here's the flight information. Come pick me up. So the next day, Mom dutifully goes to the airport, drives several hours to get to the airport, and waits for the plane to unload. An adult daughter does not get off the plane. Mom talks to the airlines. The airline says, Mom, and the adult daughter never boarded the plane. Adult daughter usually talks to her sister by social media or phone every single day, but suddenly, adult daughter has turned off all her devices and won't answer the phone, email, social media, anything. So in the country I was in, kidnapping was a real possibility. She was traveling from a conflict zone where she worked. So the family was justifiably freaked out. We tracked this woman down. It turns out that she was safe. She was healthy now. She had gone on an alcoholic bender the night before the flight and just didn't want to board. So I said, call your mother. She's concerned. So she called her mother and she said, not, sorry, Mom, I didn't get on the flight. She said, oh, Mom, I didn't get on the flight because I had malaria. So then Mom calls me and is crying, concerned that her daughter's going to die of malaria. And all I could say was, she's not going to die of malaria. She's not going to die of malaria. And her mother said, but people die of malaria. And I said, but she's not going to die of this type of malaria. And I think imaginary type of malaria. But I could not tell her mother the truth because the daughter had not signed a Privacy Act waiver. The daughter had privacy rights. If I told her mother what had happened, that would have real implications for her family relationship. It would have real implications for her job. So I, by law, could not share the full details of what had happened. So sometimes you'll see, and we reached out to the State Department for comment about this case, and the State Department would say, yes, we're aware of it, but they won't say anything else. Because maybe we wouldn't have had a chance to get permission to go visit the person in jail yet and ask them if they want us to speak to the media about their case. So sometimes, it's a good example of sometimes we know a little bit more than we are able to share. Okay, this arrest case is a standout. It involved a young sergeant who had been decorated in the Gulf War. He had 2 Purple Hearts and other decorations, and he was on terminal leave from the military. He was using that leave to go visit his missionary parents in Zambia. While he was there, he went to a public market and he bought a carved warthog tusk, which turned out to be illegal, and they picked him up at the airport. They then searched his luggage. I was present for that search. And it turns out Mom had given him what was a carved ivory letter opener. So when Mom had bought it, the vendors had said, she said, "Is this ivory?" And they said, "Oh, no, 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 it's cow bone, cow bone." So she bought it and she gave it to her unfortunate son because possession of ivory was a mandatory 5-year sentence in jail. So this is what this young man was facing. The defense attaché and I went out we attended the search. I had almost talked them off the hook for the warthog tusk until they searched the luggage and found the ivory letter opener. So then they detained him and we had to go through a full court press. I won't tell you what all we did, but eventually it escalated to the point where we, with a little bit of bluffing, said that we would put out an advisory warning people about the dangers of traveling to Zambia. We could only do this because if you do the crime, you have to do the time overseas. If you smuggle drugs, then you deserve to go to jail, wherever it is. But we could get involved because they treated him differently as an American than they did locals. This picture is my picture. I went to the local market and I was able to take that picture of ivory out there openly for sale. So what really touched me with this case was that every command this young man had worked for contacted us and said, "What can we do?" They also thought, the military thought, it wasn't true, but the military thought that he might be treated differently if he was perceived as under the protection of the U.S. military. So even though he was on terminal leave, they reinstated him so that he would continue to get paid and health care, well, theoretically, if he was in jail, through the time if he faced a sentence. So I was really proud that I told him as he left that he had stood up for his country, but this was a chance for his country to stand up for him. When we finally got him out, the defense attaché saw all the way through the process, and we waited until the plane was a little tiny dot in the air before we left. So, okay, another dramatic arrest case involved Amnesty International. There was a team of 2 Amnesty International investigators who came to the Gambia in West Africa. And they decided to meet up with a local Gambian journalist and travel up country in search of a dissident who had been disappeared, who was being held incommunicado in a secret jail. So they found out where the jail was, where he was being held, and they decided to go up to the jail, knock on the door and say, "Hello, we'd like to speak to Mr. Dissident. We're from Amnesty International." So the local officials freaked out and they detained the team and the Gambian journalist who was with them. Amnesty International has a check-in program, and when they missed their check-in, headquarters called me. So I was able to call the Gambian government and say, "I know that you have this team," which freaked out the Gambian government because then they were no longer to just hold them sort of under the cover of darkness. They knew that we knew. So eventually they had to move the team. They decided to transport them back up to the capital. And I wanted to know exactly when they were going to be in the capital because I was going to present myself and ask to see them. So this country is basically 2 sides of a river. And I knew that at a certain point they had to cross the one and only ferry. So I called the ferryman and I asked him to tip me off when the police transported the Amnesty people and the journalists across the river. So then I was able to surprise the Gambian government again and say, "I know they're here, I'd like to see them." Then for the next week, I basically parked myself in the police commissioner's office all day, every day, to let them know how important this was to the U.S. government. They eventually decided to let them go. They were going to just let the Amnesty people go, and I said, "I want the journalist too." So they released the journalist, who fled within days for his life, and the Amnesty team also got the heck out of Dodge while they could. But it's a good example of how sometimes we are able to use the spotlight of U.S. government attention to make sure the right thing is done. Just checking on time, I'm sure we're running a little long. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the worldwide COVID evacuations, because I was in the center of that storm. I was on almost every single task force. I was the liaison to Congress, so I was talking to hundreds of congressional offices to arrange for Americans when the world slammed shut. There were Americans trapped overseas. And if you think about it, there were school children on tours. There were people who were in hotels who were racking up indefinite hotel bills that they were afraid they would never be able to pay. There were people who were afraid they were going to lose their jobs that they couldn't get back. There were people who were on medications that were not locally available and, in fact, in some cases, were illegal in those countries. So we worked very hard to get Americans back from around the world. This was the first time in U.S. government history that we simultaneously evacuated Americans from every region of the world. We used a lot of charter flights because there's a law that says U.S. citizens have to pay for their own evacuations. And it's honestly a lot cheaper and a lot easier to use charter flights than it is to use military flights, although we tried using some military flights as well. There were some complications to that. But in many cases, the level of detail that went into this, if you consider in some places, some countries are the size of the United States, we had to, and these countries were in lockdown. So we sometimes had to ensure that every beat cop in a town had the license plate of every American who was driving to a rally point so that they could get on a bus that we had managed to rent so that we could drive them to another airport so that we could then fly them to a larger airport where we could fly them back to the U.S. And those countries might require that we do that in a single day, saying that you can't allow anybody to spend the night. We had issues where some countries wanted to spray Americans with God knows what kind of chemicals, and we had to say, no, you can't do that. There was one country where they wanted to take people's temperature in an unusual place, and we had to say, no, we can't allow that either. So the level of coordination that went into this is just staggering. Our contracting office, which is usually not the superstars of any show, our contracting office, which did the contracts for all of these charter flights, in 1 month they did the equivalent of 5 years worth of contracting. It was amazing. So I could go on forever about this. I will say this picture actually happens to be my brother-in-law, who is a UPS pilot, and so this is one of his flights into China at the time. But there are all kinds of stories that I could share. I will probably leave it there in the interest of time. You guys are more than welcome to ask me any questions you want. I have all kinds of stories about attending autopsies and exorcism, arrests, all kinds of things, but I don't want to run over time here for your meeting. So, but thank you for having me.
Wow. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you're going to come back and see us again.